In the wild, every quiet moment can hide a sudden storm of danger. Get ready to witness 6 gripping encounters where hunters, researchers, and rangers come face to face with nature's raw, unforgiving power. From silent stalks to explosive attacks by bears in some of the world's most remote and brutal wilderness. Prepare for tense, high-stakes battles where survival hangs by a thread. In the remote interior of Alaska's Denali backcountry, a thick curtain of spruce and birch trees filtered the morning sun into slivers of gold on July 6, 2013. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of unseen movement. Park Ranger Evan Whitaker, 32, lean and sharp-eyed, moved through the dense undergrowth with calm precision. A seasoned wildlife officer with 6 years in the field, he'd spent weeks tracking signs of illegal trapping and suspected poaching. Close behind him came Maria Ellis, a 38-year-old ranger supervisor with a background in wildlife biology and 15 years of experience in the field. Both wore light packs and carried sidearms, radios, and bear spray canisters strapped across their chests. They were 2 miles off trail, following a barely visible line of boot prints that crossed a narrow game trail. It was the 3rd day of a quiet surveillance operation based on tips about illegal black bear traps set near a salmon run. The signs had grown fresher, scraps of bait, flattened grass, disturbed brush. They hadn't seen the poachers yet, but Evan's gut told him they were close. His attention was focused forward, scanning for movement or sound, when he caught a strange, heavy scent on the wind. Musky, sour, earthy. Maria stiffened just a few feet behind him. A low rumble rolled through the trees, too deep to be anything human. Then came a crashing sound, like thick branches exploding under pressure. The forest erupted as a massive shape barreled from the right. A grizzly bear, the largest either of them had ever seen, emerging like a nightmare from a wall of alders. It was a behemoth of muscle and fury, standing nearly 7.5 feet tall even on all fours, with a thick, scarred hide that absorbed the dappled sunlight like armor. Its fur was dark, patchy in places, and caked with mud. With one bellowing roar, it charged, tearing through saplings and underbrush with thunderous force. The ground shuddered under its weight. Evan barely had time to yank the bear spray from his harness before the beast was almost on him. He raised his arm as the grizzly swung one massive paw, claws nearly 4 inches long, slashed across his forearm and tore through his jacket like paper. The blow sent him sprawling backward, the spray can tumbling from his hand. Blood poured from a deep gash, but he scrambled to his knees, stunned and breathless. Maria stepped sideways, drawing her pistol in one fluid motion, but the bear spun with shocking speed. It lunged again, jaws wide, and Maria fired. 3 rounds echoed through the trees, slamming into the bear's side. The bullets thudded uselessly against its thick muscle and dense fur. It barely flinched. Instead, it reared up onto its hind legs, towering over her, and dropped down with a crash that splintered a fallen log beneath it. The bear's fury seemed unbreakable, its eyes wild and focused only on destruction. It charged again, claws digging deep gouges into the forest floor, and this time Maria turned and sprinted toward a cluster of boulders, trying to create distance. Evan, half dazed but upright, found his bear spray and fired a burst blindly as the beast passed, the mist catching the grizzly in the face. The bear snarled in pain, blinking and shaking its massive head, but didn't stop. Maria ducked behind a downed spruce and braced herself, pistol ready, as the grizzly stormed around the log. She fired again, aiming for the face, but the shot missed and struck the shoulder. The bear swiped low, ripping bark and moss off the trunk just inches from her leg. She kicked off the log, rolling onto the slope behind it, her breath catching in gasps. Evan stumbled forward, left arm hanging uselessly at his side, and fired his last shot into the air, hoping the noise would distract the animal. For a second, it turned toward him, eyes flaring with rage, saliva stringing from its teeth. It lowered its head and charged again. Evan stood his ground, raising the empty pistol like a club. But just as the bear lunged, Maria, crouched behind the spruce, unleashed another full blast of bear spray directly into its eyes. The grizzly shrieked, a deep, guttural roar of pain and rage that echoed through the trees. It halted mid-charge, pawing at its face, and backed away, snarling and swinging its head. The mist clung to its nose and mouth. It stomped and swiped unthinkingly, throwing dirt and pine needles into the air. Seconds passed like hours. Then, with a final growl, the giant turned and crashed back into the woods, trees swaying in its wake. The sound of its retreat faded slowly, leaving only the echo of panicked breathing and the soft creak of wind through branches. Maria stood motionless, heart hammering against her ribs, hand shaking on the empty spray can. Evan dropped to one knee, clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. Neither spoke. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind and the distant caw of a raven circling overhead. They had come into the woods to find poachers, prepared for confrontation with humans. What they found instead was a force far more ancient and terrifying, a living mountain of flesh and fury, a predator that owed them no warning and needed no reason. Evan's wound was deep but not fatal, the claws missing bone by a breath. Maria had bruises and scrapes from her fall, but the real wounds were deeper, etched into their minds by the raw, overwhelming power they'd just survived. Hours later, after hiking out slowly and sending a call for medical aid, they sat near the ranger station in silence, staring into the trees. The poachers had vanished, their trail lost, but the memory of the bear, the sound of its breath, the weight of its presence, the brutal precision of its attack, remained. They had come to protect the wild, but in those violent, chaotic minutes, they had become prey. And as Evan's stitched arm throbbed and Maria's heart finally slowed, they both knew one truth more deeply than ever before. Out here, in the ancient silence of the forest, it was the wild that ruled. The wind moaned through the trees like something wounded, thick snow falling in sideways sheets against the aging walls of the hunting cabin in early October 2021. Deep in the Alaskan interior, Jesse Lockhart, 36, a carpenter turned seasonal trapper, had spent his third night alone in the structure he'd built from salvaged wood and rusted nails. It was a modest box, plywood walls, a cast-iron stove, and a single cot near the hearth. The fire had burned low, casting red shadows on the walls, and Jesse, wrapped in a wool blanket, drifted to sleep with the last embers fading behind his eyelids. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the air cooled with each hour until only a faint heat clung to the stone floor beneath the stove. Jesse stirred once, shifting in his sleep, unaware that far beyond the dark, something had picked up the scent of dried meat from his pack, jerky wrapped in waxed cloth and stashed under his cot the night before. Just before dawn, as the wind shifted direction and a bitter stillness settled across the woods, a low groan rolled through the cabin's frame. Jesse's eyes blinked open in the pale, flickering light. His breath hanging in clouds, he sat up slowly, head heavy with sleep, trying to understand what he'd heard. The groan came again, longer this time, followed by a cracking pop, as if something massive had leaned against the back wall and pushed. The plywood creaked, then split. With a deafening crash, the rear wall of the cabin buckled inward. Boards splintered and flew like matchsticks, and in their place loomed the massive, lumbering form of a Kodiak bear, thick with muscle, fur bristling with frost, and eyes dull with hunger. Its shoulders barely fit through the frame as it surged forward, claws slashing through the remains of the wall like paper. Jesse leapt from the cot, barefoot, heart stuttering, just as the bear swiped a paw the size of a shovel across the space where he'd just been. It caught his leg mid-turn, claws raking flesh. Pain tore through his calf and he screamed as he staggered toward the cabin door, fumbling with the latch as the bear advanced again, drawn by scent, warmth, and movement. He flung the door open and dove into the snow, the cold biting instantly into his skin. The world outside was white and motionless. The storm briefly calmed, but he didn't stop to breathe. Blood smeared the snow behind him as he ran. Half-dressed, his left foot sliced open by ice, arms trembling, the wound on his leg burning with every step. Behind him, there was no roar, no sound of pursuit. Jesse dove into a dense thicket 50 yards from the cabin, crawling beneath a cluster of snow-laden branches, his breath ragged and his skin burning from exposure. He curled inward, shivering violently, staring through the veil of pine needles toward the ruined cabin. But the bear didn't follow. Instead, it dragged the pack from under the cot, jerky and all, and tore it open with heavy paws. Waxed cloth shredded, leather straps popped. One by one, the bear ate, slow, methodical, silent. When it had emptied the bag, it turned once, huffed through its nose, and settled down in front of the embers, curling its enormous body into the warmest patch of air left in the cabin. Jesse didn't move. His foot throbbed, legs sticky with blood, hands tucked between his knees to preserve what little heat they could. The cold seeped in deeper with every minute. Snow clung to his hair and melted against his feverish skin, only to freeze again. He pressed his back into the snow behind him, too afraid to shift, too terrified to make a sound that might draw the bear back to the door. Time stretched. An hour passed, then two. The sky turned pale, but the trees remained silent. Jesse's hands began to go numb, and his jaw locked from shivering. He couldn't feel his toes. Still, he waited, teeth chattering, heart fluttering like a trapped bird, the faint warmth of adrenaline fading into exhaustion and cold. And still the bear didn't roar. At some point, long after Jesse had stopped counting minutes, a low mechanical hum echoed faintly in the distance. Then another, closer. Snowmobiles, patrol teams. Jesse tried to move but couldn't at first. His body resisted, stiff and frozen. He forced himself to crawl from the thicket, leaving smears of red where his knees and hands dragged through the snow. When they found him, he was curled beneath the lowest branches of a spruce, lips cracked, eyelids fluttering. He couldn't speak. He only raised one trembling arm and pointed toward the cabin. Inside, the fire had long since died, but the heat lingered. Boards were shattered and strewn across the floor. Blood painted a jagged trail from the door to the cot. The meat was gone. The woodpile was untouched. The Kodiak was nowhere to be seen, but claw marks scored the wall in deep, splintered furrows, and massive prints still marked the floorboards. The search team stood in silence, staring at the destruction, unsure what was more unsettling, that the bear had come so violently, or that it had stayed so quietly. Later, as Jesse was airlifted to a clinic for frostbite treatment and wound care, he finally spoke. He whispered that the bear never made a sound, not even when it destroyed the wall or dragged out the pack. He hadn't seen rage or panic in its eyes, only hunger and something colder. What haunted him more than the pain, more than the fear, was that the bear hadn't chased him, not because it failed to notice him, but because it didn't need to. It had simply come in, taken what it wanted, and claimed the heat he had left behind. The Amur Valley lay wrapped in the heavy cloak of late afternoon shadows, the thick birch forest stretching endlessly across the hillsides, where golden light struggled to pierce through branches, heavy with the approaching dusk. Two hunters, Mikhail and Sergei, moved steadily but cautiously uphill, their boots crunching quietly on frozen leaves and brittle twigs on that June evening in 2010. They had spent years tracking games together through these wild, remote stretches of Siberia, their bond forged in hardship and the pursuit of survival. Mikhail, older by 5 years and seasoned by experience, was a steady presence with a sharp eye and calm mind. Sergei, younger and quicker to act, carried an energy sharpened by the cold winters and the constant challenge of hunting in these unforgiving woods. Both men carried well-worn rifles, the metal dulled by years of harsh conditions and repeated cleaning. Their packs bore the weight of months of preparation, ammo, food, survival gear, but neither of them was complacent. They knew the dangers of the wilderness here were as real as the game they pursued. The bears were enormous, powerful predators that demanded respect and caution. They had stalked this valley for weeks, following trails, examining signs, watching for movement among the thick birch stands that seemed to close in around them. The sun was sinking fast, the golden hour slipping toward dusk, and the air had turned cold enough to bite exposed skin. Their breath came in visible puffs as they paused briefly to scan the forest, listening for the faint crack of a twig or the soft rustle of an animal. The forest was almost silent, save for the occasional distant call of a crow or the whisper of wind through the branches. Sergei stepped ahead, leading the way up a narrow game trail carved into the slope by deer and smaller creatures. His rifle was raised as he moved through the trees, eyes sharp, muscles coiled to react at the first sign of movement. Suddenly, without warning, the underbrush exploded to his right, and a monstrous form erupted from the shadows. A Russian grizzly bear, massive beyond imagining, surged into view. Its dark fur was matted with dirt and snow, muscles bulging beneath its thick coat. The animal stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, but it was now on all fours, charging forward with terrifying speed. The bear's eyes locked on Sergei, cold and merciless, no warning roar escaping its massive jaws. Sergei's hand jerked upward, rifle raised in a desperate reflex. He pulled the trigger. Click. The rifle jammed. Panic seized him in an instant. He cursed beneath his breath and shouted a sharp warning to Mikhail, but before the words could fully form, the bear was upon him. The impact was like a freight train smashing into a fragile barrier. Sergei was thrown backward, crushed hard against the slope, snow and loose soil tumbling around him. The world spun as the bear's massive paws tore into his jacket and flesh, claws raking deep and cruel. Pain exploded through his shoulder and neck, hot and sharp, tearing muscle and skin in ragged, merciless lines. Mikhail's heart pounded as he froze for a heartbeat, then reacted with the years of training buried deep inside him. He raised his rifle and fired. The first shot cracked through the still air and struck the bear's thick side. The animal flinched but did not falter, snarling with rage as it pressed the attack. Another bullet ripped into the beast's shoulder, but it barely slowed. Again, Mikhail fired, his breath ragged, hands trembling with adrenaline and fear. The bear's massive head snapped toward him, eyes blazing, teeth bared. The ground shook beneath its weight as it mauled Sergei, teeth sinking into flesh, ripping, crushing. Sergei's cries cut sharply and desperately through the forest before abruptly stopping, swallowed by the thick underbrush. The bear finally released its grip, and without a roar or a glance back, turned away, retreating into the dense forest with a cold, purposeful gait. There was no bluff charge, no threat display, only the quiet, deadly silence of a predator that had claimed its prey. Mikhail stood alone, trembling, his rifle still raised. The old weapon, reliable in so many hunts before, had failed at the worst possible moment. The jammed rifle, a well-used but trusted tool, had betrayed him in the seconds that counted most. The shots he fired had landed, but they were not enough, not fast enough, to stop the bear's brutal assault. He approached Sergei cautiously, heart heavy, stomach twisting with dread. His friend lay broken and pale among the fallen leaves and patches of snow, eyes closed beneath swollen lids, the deep wounds across his chest and neck a cruel testament to the power of the attack. Years of friendship and shared hunts ended in an instant, torn apart by a raw, primal force. Kneeling beside him, Mikhail fought the rising wave of grief and shock, pressing a trembling hand to Sergei's cold chest. There was no sign of life. The silence of the forest pressed in around him, thick with loss and fear, as the shadows deepened and the cold settled in. The sounds of the attack echoed endlessly in Mikhail's mind. The explosion of movement, the deafening thud of the bear's charge, the agonized cries, and then the merciless tearing of flesh. The failure of his rifle haunted him more than the fear or pain. Every moment he had spent trying to clear the jam, every second lost, had cost Sergei his life. For hours after the attack, Mikhail remained at his friend's side, eyes scanning the dim forest for any sign of the bear's return. But the woods were silent. The only movement, the slow fall of snow settling on broken branches and blood-stained earth. He wrapped Sergei's lifeless form in a spare jacket and began the slow, painful descent down the slope, each step a heavy weight of sorrow and regret. That night, alone by a small fire, Mikhail's thoughts turned over the events again and again. The rifle, the jammed weapon that had become useless at the moment it was needed most. His shots, though true, had come too late, too few. He had fired with desperation but lacked the time or means to stop the relentless charge. He still hears the sounds, the pounding footsteps racing through the birch, the sudden silence that swallowed the forest, and then the sickening crack of bone breaking just meters away. These sounds follow him in every quiet moment, in the stillness before sleep, a haunting reminder of how quickly the balance between hunter and hunted can shatter. The forest itself seems to hold no judgment. It remains vast, indifferent, a place where strength and failure coexist, where the wild claims what it needs without question. Mikhail knows the valley will wait patiently, as it always has, for the next hunters to test its laws. But he will never forget the price of a misfire, the brutal finality of a weapon's failure, and the weight of a lifetime lost in a single, terrifying moment. Before dawn broke over the dense maple woods of northern Vermont, Eric Nolan had already been awake for hours, moving quietly through the cold air to set up his tree stand. A seasoned bow hunter in his late 30s, Eric was a man shaped by patience and precision, someone who trusted the rhythm of the forest and the subtle shifts of wind and light. He carried with him a lightweight bow, arrows fletched with feathers from previous hunts, and a quiet reverence for the woods that had been his sanctuary since childhood. By the time the first pale light of October 2nd, 1999, streaked through the branches, Eric had climbed the ladder to the platform, 15 feet above the forest floor. The stand was nestled in a thick cluster of maples, their trunks broad and bark rough beneath his fingers. The air was crisp and still, heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss. He settled into position, crouching low behind the camouflaged netting he'd hung, waiting for the subtle signs of deer or other game. The morning hours passed slowly, the forest alive with sounds, birds calling, twigs snapping under the cautious steps of small animals, the faint rustle of wind weaving through the leaves. Eric's eyes scanned the ground, seeking movement, his breath steady as he kept still. But the usual presence of deer was absent. Instead, an unusual sound drew his attention, a soft rustling, deeper and heavier than the brush stirred by a deer. It came from below, near the base of the tree. Eric's heart quickened, not out of fear but out of intense curiosity. The movement grew louder, deliberate, and slow. Then, to his surprise, a young black bear began climbing the very tree he occupied. The bear's movements were careful and measured, paws pressing against the bark, claws finding purchase as it ascended inch by inch. It sniffed at the rough maple, seemingly unaware of Eric's presence so close above. Its fur was thick and black. Its eyes were dark and alert, yet unknowing. The animal's breathing was steady and calm. Eric froze, watching silently, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. By the time the bear's head tilted upward and it looked directly toward him, it was already 6 feet below the platform. Their eyes locked, black depths meeting brown, and for a brief moment, time seemed suspended in the still forest. The bear paused, then resumed its climb, moving with a slow determination that spoke of something beyond simple curiosity. Eric's mind raced. He knew the dangers of close encounters with bears, especially when confined in a tree. He whispered a soft warning, barely audible, then clapped his hands together gently, hoping to startle the bear enough to retreat. But the bear did not flinch. It climbed higher. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as the massive creature reached the wooden platform. He pushed outward with his foot, trying to knock the bear away, but the animal swatted back in perfect rhythm, its powerful paw catching his boot with crushing force. A sharp, searing pain shot through Eric's leg as he felt a tendon tear under the assault. Pain surged, but there was no time to think. The bear lunged, claws raking, teeth flashing, and Eric reacted instinctively, grappling with the beast in a desperate struggle. Their bodies locked for seconds that stretched like hours, limbs tangled in a fierce contest of strength and will. Eric's fingers scraped bark and fur, the raw bite of fear cutting through his adrenaline-fueled focus. Then, suddenly the bear slipped, lost its hold, and dropped from the platform. It landed with a heavy thud on the forest floor below. No growl, no frantic noise, just the solid impact of weight on earth. The animal rose, shook itself briefly as if nothing had happened, and then turned, walking off calmly into the woods. Eric remained perched, chest heaving, pain burning in his leg, but his mind sharp and alert. He knew he had been lucky, not just to survive, but to escape without deeper injury or worse. Slowly, after nearly 2 hours of waiting, he climbed down the ladder, each step slow and cautious, the torn tendon pulling sharply with every movement. At the base of the tree, he limped toward his truck parked along the narrow forest road. His face was pale, sweat mixed with snow melting on his brow. He didn't speak of the encounter to anyone, carrying the memory as a heavy, silent burden. From that day forward, Eric never brought a bow into the woods again. The weapon, once an extension of his patience and skill, now seemed a fragile tool against the unpredictable power of nature. Instead, he took binoculars, a camera, and field notes, turning his hunts into quiet observations rather than battles. Still, every season, Eric returns to that same maple grove, drawn by the lingering connection to the forest and the unspoken challenge it represents. But now, he watches the trees before the ground. He checks the branches, the rough bark, and the quiet spaces where the wild might watch back. He knows the woods hold secrets deeper than the eyes can see, and the bear's silent, measured climb taught him that sometimes survival is about respect, patience, and knowing when to hold still, not just in the stand, but in the ever-shifting balance of the wild. The Absaroka Range lay deep and dark under a blanket of stars, its rugged peaks lost in shadows that crept like ghosts through the towering pines. Two brothers, Evan and Tyler Mason, had chosen this remote wilderness for a hunting trip, far from roads and cell signals, where the wild ruled unchallenged. They shared a single tent pitched on a patch of frozen earth, nestled between large boulders and dense stands of fir. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen. Evan, 28, lean and alert with years of survival training, and Tyler, 32, broader, with a calm confidence shaped by countless nights spent under open skies. After a long day scouting elk trails and hauling gear uphill, the brothers had settled in near a small creek. They shared a sparse meal by the campfire, their voices low and careful, the crackling flames painting their faces in shifting orange hues. As night deepened, they crawled into their tent, the fabric walls offering little protection against the cold or the forest beyond. Exhaustion pulled at their limbs, but the wilderness demanded vigilance. Around 3 a.m. on September 23, 2017, the woods outside fell deathly silent. The wind died, and the usual chorus of night sounds faded into an eerie hush. Both men lay awake, senses stretched tight. Then came the faintest crack, a twig snapping sharply in the darkness. It was subtle, but to hunters like Evan and Tyler, it screamed of something larger, closer. Their breath slowed, muscles tensed. Neither whispered. They listened as the twig snapped, multiplying slowly and deliberately, creeping closer to the tent. The sound shifted, branches scraping softly against fabric, until suddenly, the tent wall buckled inward with explosive force. The nylon tore with a loud rip, poles snapping under the weight of something immense. Without warning, a massive grizzly bear crashed through the side of their tent, its enormous bulk filling the space like a storm. It landed directly on Evan's torso with crushing weight, pinning him to the frozen ground. The air whooshed from his lungs in a sharp gasp, but no scream escaped. His mind snapped into survival mode, even as ribs cracked beneath the bear's powerful paws, the bone shattering in harsh, grinding pulses. Evan's head was forced to one side. His breath came in ragged, shallow bursts as the bear's heavy paws pawed at his chest, ripping flesh and muscle. The crushing pressure pressed down again and again, each impact reverberating through his body, stabbing pain shooting in every direction. His vision blurred and darkened at the edges, but his mind clung desperately to awareness. Nearby, Tyler fought for breath, terror choking him in the confined space. He watched helplessly as the bear moved away from Evan's broken body toward their food pack hanging just outside the tent's entrance, a bag heavy with canned fish, jerky, and other scents that had lured the predator. Tyler's heart thundered. His hand fumbled at his boot, where he'd stashed the bear spray for emergencies like this. His fingers shook uncontrollably, but he managed to grasp the canister and bring it up in a blind spray, releasing a thick cloud of irritating mist into the night air. The bear snarled, a low, guttural sound filled with rage and confusion. It staggered back, shaking its massive head to clear the burning spray from its eyes and nostrils. For a terrifying moment, Tyler feared it would attack again, But instead, it turned and vanished silently into the surrounding darkness, disappearing like a shadow retreating into the black forest. Evan lay beneath the shattered tent, chest crushed, but miraculously intact. Though pain radiated from every broken rib, he remained alive. The shock numbed much of the agony, but each breath was a sharp, searing reminder of his fragile state. His eyes fluttered open and closed, unable to move, but his mind was still fighting. 2 hours later, as dawn broke and the cold light filtered weakly through the trees, rescuers arrived. Rangers had been alerted by the brothers' emergency call, sent before the attack had overwhelmed them. When they approached the campsite, they found the torn tent hanging limp from snapped poles, blood smearing the frozen earth around it. The food pack was shredded, its contents scattered like evidence of the bear's presence. Most chilling of all were the paw prints. Massive bear tracks circled the campsite 3 times before the animal made its entrance through the side of the tent. The ground was soft with melted snow, preserving the deliberate path of the bear's quiet stalk. It hadn't rushed in or charged unthinkingly. It had waited, circling and watching, calculating its move with cold, patient deliberation. Investigators later concluded that the attack had not been a blind, rage-driven mauling. Instead, the bear was hungry, opportunistic, and unnervingly strategic. It chose to ambush at the darkest hour, breaking into the tent with brutal efficiency. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but for Evan and Tyler, time had stretched into an endless nightmare. In the dark, they said, every second felt like an hour, every breath a desperate fight to survive. Evan's recovery was a long and grueling process. His chest remained tender, broken ribs slowly knitting under layers of bruised muscle and scarred tissue. Yet it was the psychological wounds that lingered deeper, the overwhelming sense of vulnerability, the memory of crushing weight, the silence of the bear that never roared, never growled, simply waited and struck. Tyler never forgot the helplessness of watching the bear's shadow fall over his brother, the sheer force of nature unleashed on a body too fragile to withstand it. Their bond, forged in years of shared adventures and survival, was forever marked by that night in the Absaroka wilderness. Even now, Evan says he can still hear the soft crack of twigs, the silent padding of massive paws, and the dreadful pause before the tent exploded inward. He remembers the cold grip of pain and fear, and the unbearable stretch of waiting to die. The wilderness had shown them its merciless side, silent, patient, and unyielding. And for 2 brothers caught in its dark heart, the memory would haunt every step they took in the wild again. The wind howled like a living thing on March 21, 2006, tearing across the desolate ice ridge in the heart of the Arctic. Snow blasted sideways, whipping against faces and biting through layers of thick parkas and insulated gloves. The ridge itself was a fractured labyrinth of sharp crevasses and unstable ice, a dangerous place that demanded the full attention of the glaciology team spread out along its length. Each member moved carefully, their boots crunching on brittle, wind-polished snow, eyes scanning the frozen terrain for hidden cracks that could swallow them whole. Anton Petrov, the team's lead researcher, was focused on mapping a newly discovered crevasse. At 42, he was seasoned and cautious, respected for his methodical approach and steady nerves in hazardous conditions. He had separated from the main group by a few dozen meters to take precise measurements near the edge of the ice ridge, carefully adjusting his instruments as gusts of icy wind threatened to disrupt his work. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a pale shape cresting the snow rise above him. For a moment, Anton thought it must be one of his colleagues, bundled in a white parka, blending perfectly into the frozen landscape like a ghost in the snow. But then the figure dropped to all fours and began moving forward steadily, unmistakably animal. Anton's breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the pale bear descending the slope toward him. The creature's thick fur was almost white against the snow, camouflaged in the stark environment. Its large paws made soft impressions in the icy crust, the heavy steps muffled by the swirling wind. The scent of the bear was undetectable, the howling gale masking even the faintest trace of its presence. The roar of the wind swallowed the sound of its movement. The bear's slow, deliberate approach sent a chill through Anton's body deeper than the cold. It was not running, nor was it charging. It was steadily advancing with its head held low, its eyes fixed on the small group below. There was no warning growl, no bluff charge, only a calm, measured intent that made the encounter all the more terrifying. Anton reached for his radio, voice tense but steady as he called out to the others. The team immediately ceased their work, their attention drawn by the urgent warning crackling through the static. They froze, eyes wide and breath visible in the cold air, as the bear came fully into view, its pale coat blending almost seamlessly with the icy surroundings. The researchers scrambled for their safety gear. Flares were pulled from packs and ignited, sending bright sparks into the gray sky. But the first flare fizzled uselessly, falling short and melting harmlessly into the snow. Another flare went off, showering the ground with brilliant light and smoke, but it landed too far from the bear to have any effect. The bear continued its slow, unhurried advance. It was closing in, now less than 30 meters from the nearest team member. The tension in the air was suffocating. No one moved, everyone watching as the bear's eyes locked on them, unblinking and unyielding. One of the guides, a tall man with years of Arctic experience, raised his rifle carefully and fired a shot into the snow just ahead of the bear. The sharp report echoed through the frozen expanse, a harsh contrast to the muffled roar of the wind. The bear stopped instantly, its head snapping up to blink slowly in confusion. For a long moment, time seemed to stretch. The bear's gaze flickered between the researchers and the disturbed snow where the bullet had landed. It tilted its massive head once, considering. Then after what felt like an eternity, it turned away. Without a sound, it began to retreat, melting back into the swirling white landscape as if it had never been there. The group exhaled, tension releasing in a collective wave of relief. They hurriedly gathered their equipment and began to move down the ridge, boots crunching urgently on the ice. The wind remained relentless, the cold pressing into their bones, but the threat had passed, for now. The ride back to base on the snowmobiles was long and heavy, marked by silence. The men and women stared ahead, each absorbed in their thoughts. The encounter replayed endlessly in their minds, the eerie stillness of the bear's approach, its slow, ghost-like gait, the chilling calm in its eyes. No one spoke, their voices lost to the wind and snow. Anton's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the handlebars, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his veins. The bear had been a shadow, a living force of nature perfectly adapted to the harsh world of ice and snow. It had not charged, had not attacked, but its presence had been an unmistakable reminder of the power and unpredictability of the wilderness. Later, when the team would write their reports, they would describe the encounter in clinical terms. An unexpected sighting of a polar bear in a rare location, a close approach masked by environmental conditions, and a cautious retreat after a warning shot. But none of the words could capture the raw tension, the feeling of standing on the edge of a frozen abyss with a massive predator slowly closing the distance. The bear had been patient and silent, an almost spectral force that moved with the slow certainty of ice itself. It had tested them, and when faced with resistance, it had chosen to back away, not out of fear, but out of calculation. For the glaciologist, the experience would linger long after the snow had melted. It was a stark lesson in respect and humility, a reminder that beneath the beauty and scientific intrigue of their work lay a wild world far older and more dangerous than any human presence. On that ice ridge, under the relentless wind and beneath the pale Arctic sky, they had come face to face with the silent power of nature, a power that did not roar or charge, but moved with the steady certainty of survival itself.